Dorothea Helen Gray Puente was born in Redlands, California, on January 9, 1929. Her childhood was marked by tragedy. Her father died of tuberculosis when she was 8, and her mother died in a motorcycle crash a few days after Christmas the next year. The children were sent to an orphanage. By 16, Puente was doing sex work out of a motel to survive. As World War II came to a close, she started seeing 22-year-old soldier Fred McFall. A few months later, they married in Reno. On their marriage certificate, Puente listed herself as 30-year-old Sheriel A. Risail. She could pass for anyone she wanted to be by the way she acted. Risail? That was a name she made up, I think, McFall said in 1988. I don't know where she'd come up with this S.T. out of a clear blue sky. There was very little married bliss for the McFalls. They had 2 children, but one was sent to live with family in Sacramento and the other was adopted. In 1948, Puente was arrested in Riverside for passing forged checks. McFall filed for divorce and Puente went to jail. The ensuing 2 decades were a cyclone of marriages, arrests, prison sentences and schemes. She served time for running a brothel in Sacramento and gained a reputation with law enforcement for sneakily cashing benefits checks mailed to her tenants. To avoid probation officers, Puente frequently used fake identities, including telling people she was an Egyptian-Israeli woman named Tia Singoala Nayarda. Husband number 4, Pedro Angel Montalvo, knew her as a doctor-actor from a big Mexican family. Their marriage was driven into the ground due to her spending habits. She wanted new pantyhose every day. Montalvo complained to the Sacramento Bee. She thought she was rich. In 1968, she married Roberto José Puente, whose name she would keep longer than the marriage. 16 months after the wedding, the relationship was over. Now in her 40s, Puente transformed her appearance. She'd always been known for her brassy, sexy makeup and dress, but suddenly she began wearing baggy, modest clothes and stopped dyeing her hair. She told new acquaintances she was a devoted Christian and loved serving her community in Sacramento by opening up her lovely home on F Street. She took in homeless individuals and people struggling with alcoholism and mental health issues. She hosted AA meetings, and local social workers knew her as a reliable placement for their clients. In 1982, a tenant named Ruth Monroe died in Puente's house. The coroner ruled Monroe died of an overdose of codeine and acetaminophen. In an interview with investigators, Puente said Monroe was despondent and likely intentionally overdosed. The death was ruled a suicide. Not even a month later, police returned to the boarding house after another tenant, a 74-year-old retiree, said Puente had drugged him. While drugged, he claimed she'd stolen from him. Puente, who had been given several years probation in 1978 for cashing dozens of her tenants' benefits checks, was sentenced to 5 years jail time. Bored in prison, Puente found herself a pen pal, 77-year-old Oregon resident Everson Gilmouth. When she was released in 1985 after serving 3 years, Gilmouth drove down to California to pick her up. He expected they would marry soon after. But in November 1985, Gilmouth fell off the map. Puente hired a worker to help her do some small renovations around her house, including constructing a 6-foot by 3-foot box with a lid. She said it was for some trash she wanted to discard. When the worker returned the next day, she asked him to put the heavy box in the back of his pickup truck so they could dump it on the side of the road. They drove down Garden Highway into Sutter County, where Puente picked a spot by the Sacramento River to leave the box. 2 months later, on New Year's Day 1986, a fisherman saw what looked like a floating coffin in the water. Wisely, he decided not to open the box and instead called 911. Police discovered a dead man inside. It would be another 3 years before Gilmouth's body was identified. His unsuspecting family was still receiving letters on his behalf, written by his new girlfriend Puente. Finally, though, the walls closed in on Puente. In November 1988, police arrived at her home to look for Montoya. As they excavated her backyard, they found 7 bodies, most wrapped in sheets or tarps. One body had been there so long the growing roots of a peach tree had curled around it. They were identified as Leona Carpenter, 78, Montoya, 51, Dorothy Miller, 64, Benjamin Fink, 55, James Gallup, 62, Vera Faye Martin, 64, and Betty Palmer, 78. Distressed neighbors told the media they had complained for months about the smell emanating from the neatly kept backyard. "We couldn't stand it," one told the San Francisco Examiner. "It definitely was something dead. It had a sweet, sickly smell." When confronted, Puente said it was just fertilizer. That was not the only red flag about Puente's boarding house. A neighbor said Puente was territorial about the property. If somebody walked on her lawn, she'd cuss at them in language that would make a sailor blush, they said, and a taxi driver who regularly picked Puente up so she could run errands said she claimed she had a cursed room in her home where people died all the time of bleeding ulcers. Her tenants always seemed to be disappearing, but because Puente often took in struggling or addicted people, when social workers asked after them, she just said they must have moved along. One Sacramento social worker wept as she talked to the Examiner. "I've done placement with homeless people, helped them get their money and stabilize their lives," she said. "Now I wonder if they would have been better off if they'd stayed homeless." Meanwhile, a manhunt gripped the region as the innocuous-looking landlady walked away from the scene. She made it down to Los Angeles, where she immediately found her next mark, an older gentleman at a bar. While chatting him up, the man recognized her from television coverage of the murders and called police. When Sacramento TV station KCRA learned Puente had been picked up in LA, they flew down in a private jet to cover the story. Eager to get her charged back in Sacramento, detectives asked KCRA if they could take the chartered plane back up with Puente in tow. KCRA agreed on the condition they could interview Puente on the flight back. Detectives wouldn't allow any questions directly related to the murders, so the interview was short and strange. Puente said she used to do extensive volunteer work and, putting on a faraway expression, murmured almost theatrically, "I used to be a very good person at one time." She was charged with the murders of 8 tenants, including the previously ruled suicide of Monroe, and her one-time boyfriend Gilmouth. Prosecutors alleged she drugged each one, strangled them and then continued to collect their benefits. She hired day workers to dig holes in her backyard, and then surreptitiously dumped the bodies and refilled the holes. After a month of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on 3 of the 9 counts of murder. It was enough, at last, to put her in prison for the rest of her life.